This video is just a quick tutorial in PowerShell just to show some of the basic concepts and kind of get you familiar with PowerShell. I'm using the PowerShell ISE. We're going to start simple with just some basic commands, and I'll kind of work my way up. And really what I'm trying to get to is objects in this video, right? I think one of the powerful things about PowerShell is that you can work with objects, and it has a lot of native tools for working with objects, and it makes for some interesting things you can do in the PowerShell that weren't possible in the old command line. If you're using PowerShell for system administration, a lot of cool stuff you can do. And PowerShell is really in its own right, its own kind of programming language. There's a lot of neat little scripting things you can do with PowerShell. So hopefully this will give you some ideas. But to start with, using ISE, so you could run all these commands I'm going to show you. You could run them in the command line, right? So you can open up, if you type PowerShell on most Windows machines, you'll get the PowerShell command prompt. But here I'm using the ISE, which is also available on most Windows machines. If you type PowerShell, one of the options you'll see is ISE. What's nice about the ISE is that you have this top pane where you can type your scripts, and when you run those scripts, it'll give you the output at the bottom. You could also just type commands at the bottom as well. It works just like any other PowerShell prompt, with a few minor differences that aren't really important here for this video. But just from a, starting from the beginning here, in PowerShell, we call the commands that you run are cmdlets, right? Usually type they're usually written cmdlets, right? Cmdlets. And they're usually a verb-noun phrasing, so get something, do something, right? So a verb and then a noun, so you're doing something with something, right? As an example, and they don't have to be named like this, right? It's just the convention in PowerShell. But if I start typing the word get, and this is one of the nice things about ISE, as I start typing cmdlets, it'll kind of hint me and say, here's a bunch of cmdlets that I found that match what you're typing, right? So for example, if I start typing process, it shows up over here, and I can get a list of my processes. So if I hit the play button here, or the run script button, this is just going to output a list of all my processes and some of the other parameters about processes. So we'll kind of start here, but I want to show you as well. Here's another command. GetChildItem is a common one, right? This is how you would show the contents of a directory, right? And if you want, you can pass arguments to the commandlet, right? So if I type a dash, it's going to give me a bunch of different things I could use for the argument. So for example, I'm going to say get the contents of C:\\, right? And by the way, this time when I hit that run select or the play button, I'm not going to hit the play button because that'll run both of these commandlets. I only want to run the commandlet on the line that I'm working with. So I'm going to click the run selection button at the top. It's a nice useful tool because if you're writing a script and you've got lots of lines and you just want to test what one line is going to do, you can just hit that button. It'll only run that single line. You can also highlight multiple lines. It will only run the multiple lines that you've highlighted. So GetChildItem basically shows me all the contents in that directory in my C drive, right? If I leave off the dash path, I can still run it. It's just going to run based on what's in my current directory, right? So as another example, right, if I do I just want to show you this as well. Like a lot of things in PowerShell, get-childitem is sort of the official commandlet, but you could also just type dir and it does the same thing. So it's very similar to the dir command in a DOS prompt. And if you're familiar with Linux, you might use the ls command instead, right? Not only is the output exactly the same here, but these are really, ls and dir are really aliases to getChildItem. So you could use getChildItem or you could use ls or dir. It doesn't really matter. Some people will say it's better to use the longer name, the official name, because it's less ambiguous, but it doesn't matter. And a lot of the PowerShell commandlets are like this, where there are aliases that are kind of a shortened form. It can be a little bit annoying if you're trying to read somebody else's script and you don't know those shortened forms, or maybe you're only familiar with the shortened forms of the commandlet and they're using the longer name, right? So it can get annoying, but I just want to let you know that you may see other scripts that use different commandlets that are really doing the same thing, right? They're just using an alias, or maybe you learned the alias and you never knew the real name. But let's move on from here. So give me 1 second. I'm going to bring up some notes here as I go through this. So as an example, and I'll just remove these up here since we're kind of done with that. We're going to work with the ls command. And one of the neat things about these commandlets, right? So what you're actually getting here when you run the ls command is an object, right? You can think of the output of the ls command as an object that contains lots of items in it, right? As an example, if I type the ls command and I pipe this to another commandlet called getMember, that's going to show me all the stuff that's available in the object, in the ls object, right? So each record I get back from the ls command, right? I'm going to have a whole bunch of different items, but each one of those items can have all these different properties. For example, the link type, the mode, the target, the create date, the last updated date, all kind, the name of the file, the full name of the file, the parent directory of the file. So it has all these different, properties about that file or that folder that we're listing with the ls command, which is really, GetChildItem. So I can work with all of those different things. And by the way, with PowerShell, if I surround the command with parentheses, right? So if I surround it with parentheses, that's telling PowerShell, execute what's inside those parentheses and treat that whole thing as an object. It's inside those parentheses. So now I can work with ls as an object. So if I hit the dot on here, I can select just a certain property. For example, base name, right? So if I run just that line, now I get just the file names, right? There are other properties, right? I'll show you another example. We can output the creation time, right? It'll output the creation time of all my files. So you can access all these different properties. Now this opens the door to being able to do more interesting things, right? So let's say I wanted to only get the full name and the last time somebody wrote to that file, right? The last time somebody wrote to it. That's all I really am interested in, right? So instead of trying to find all that stuff the old-fashioned way and right-clicking on files and all that stuff, this is where PowerShell really starts to give you some additional tools. So what I can do here is I can take the ls command, pipe it to another commandlet, and I'll talk more about what this does in a little bit. I'm just giving you an introduction here, and we'll dive into these commandlets a little bit more in the rest of the video. But for each object is going to take each item that's in ls, really, which is just a list of my folders or directories or files in that directory. All right, it's going to take all those items that it found with the ls command, and it's going to pipe it into the for each command. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the pipe. It's used in lots of, shells, right? You use it in Linux in the bash shell. You could use, pipe worked in DOS prompts, right? Well, it works in PowerShell as well, but it's a little bit different in PowerShell because you're passing the entire object, right? In most of those other, shell environments like bash and the corn shell and so forth in Linux and in the DOS prompt in Windows, you're not passing objects, you're just passing strings typically, right? But here, these are actual objects, right, that have properties and values of those properties, and the properties have typecasting and so forth. So for each object, I can say do something for each one of those objects. So take the ls command, and for each object, I want to do something. And in this case, I'm going to write to the host, right? Write host just means output to the screen some value. So the $_ is a special variable name, which basically says, for each record, go and take the current record that I'm in, right? So the for each command is saying iterate through all the items in that object that I got back from ls, and $_ is whichever is the current object, right? So this is going to iterate through all of them. And I'll show you this kind of longhand in a little bit. Again, I'm just giving you kind of a preview here of what we're looking at in this video, but I can show, for example, the full name, and I'm also going to write the last write time. Oops, sorry. So it should be, let's see, yep, last write time. There it is. So this will output both the full name and the last write time. And if I run that, I get this, kind of this listing. Now the only problem is with this listing that you see here, it's kind of all jumbled together and it's kind of hard to read, right? So another cool thing about the PowerShell is we can do multiple pipes for one thing, just like most other scripting and shell environments. But there's another commandlet that we'll find that we use a lot, right, is format table, which just gives you a nice format for your output. Now the problem here is the write-host is basically passing just that string with those two values into format table. So this is where you start to see that, yes, everything is objects in PowerShell, but the ls command is passing this sort of multi-valued object into for each object so it can iterate through them. But as I iterate through them, what I'm passing to format table is just a string on each iteration, right? I'm just passing a string for each time I iterate through. So it's just outputting that string. It's one big object, right? Because I'm not formatting it as an object, right? So we have to learn how to work with things as objects and not just as scalar strings or even arrays. So another way that I could do this to get the same information that I'm interested in here, right? I'm going to run the ls command, but I'm going to go directly to format table, right? So format table has some interesting options, right? But one of those is you can tell it which properties you're interested in. So in this case, I want the full name of the file, and I want the last write time. And I can even get the extension, right? That's another variable. And how did I know all this? I get it from here, right? I do list member, and it tells me all the different things that I can work with that object has, right? So these are all the different properties of that object that I could work with. So I just go and find the ones that I want, and I list them in here. And if I output that, now I've got a nice table format. I've got my full name of the file, the last time somebody wrote to it, and then I've got the extension here on the end, which is nice, right? I can even take this one step further. I'll show you another commandlet. So another commandlet is where object. So where object says take the output of ls, which is all those files and folders in that directory, right, as an object. Each one of them is an item, that has properties and so forth. So it's going to iterate through those, and it's going to basically extract from there based on some parameters that I give it. So for example, I could say only where, and again, there's that $_ again, right? So for each item in ls, I am going to look for where the extension, for example, is equal. And by the way, the -eq is a Boolean logic operator in PowerShell. You wouldn't use the equal sign for equal, because that's how you make something equal to something, right? Which you're going to see in a few minutes. Use -eq. There's -neq, which is not equal to, -gt for greater than, -lt for less than, right? So it's a little different than if you're familiar with other programming languages. It's a little bit different, right? But this is actually similar if you're familiar with scripting in Bash, right? This is very similar to how Bash scripts work, right? When you'd use Boolean operators. All right, so I want to look for only, let's see what type of file. How about text files, right? So only where it's .txt. Now I'm going to surround that with single quotes so it knows that it's a string. I could probably get away without putting quotes around it at all. Certain things you can in the PowerShell. So if I run this, it's only going to find the files that are .txt, right? And there it is. And here it just gives me the mode, the last write time, the length of the file, and the name. That's the default in the table that gets output by ls. However, which by the way is defined in that object, right? That's how PowerShell knows that those should be the defaults, right? Even though there's other properties which are just hidden in the default view. But they're there. I could access them if I wanted to. And just to show you, I could also surround this with double quotes. PowerShell is pretty forgiving with double and single quotes. There are certain scenarios where you have to use single, certain where you have to use double, and I'll talk about that in another video. But in any event, let's see if that works with the double, and it still does, right? But I could pipe this yet again. So now, because where object, the output of where object is just another object, but it's basically only the objects that you're filtering on, right? So I'm saying just get me the objects where the extension is .txt. So now it's a much shorter list of items in that object. So now I can pass that to format table, right? Just like I did before. So I'm passing that up. So here, instead of going ls directly to format table, I'm going ls to filter it, then to format table. In Bash, you might use grep, for example, to do something like this, very similar. But again, you're just going to get strings as the output. It's a little bit harder to work with it. So this is definitely more powerful in some ways. All right, so format table, we're going to pass it some properties. I'm going to give it the same list of properties. So we're going to get the full name, last write time, and the extension, just like I did before, and that should give me a nice table. There you go. So now I've got the full name, last write time, and the extension. I could add other properties if I wanted to, or only show certain properties, right? So pretty straightforward. So that's kind of a preview of PowerShell, right? Of how you can kind of work with it. So let's get back to the basics here, though, how we work with variables. So variables in PowerShell are always going to have the $sign in front of it, right? So anything with a $sign in front of it is going to be a variable. So in this case, I'm just going to create a variable called myvar, and I'm going to make it foo, right? every first little demonstration, we always use foo, right? And I could create another one, right? So my other variable, $my other var equals bar, right? Got to do the typical foo bar. So now I've got foo and I've got bar in two different variable names. Very, very simple. This is just a string. I could output the value. So if I type right-host, it's going to output the value of the variable. So I'm just going to do my var. I'll run this whole thing. Now, what's cool about PowerShell 2 when you're working with the ISE is if you just run a single line, right? If I just put my cursor here in this line and I execute just this line, this variable is now set, my other var, and likewise this one has already been set with foo. If I want to see what the value of that variable is, I can just highlight it like this, hit the play button up here, the run selection, and it's only going to execute this, what I've highlighted, which just tells the PowerShell output whatever's in that variable, which it did down here at the bottom, so I can see that it has foo in it. So it's useful for doing troubleshooting, right? And I could output with right-host, you can output two variables at the same time, right? So we'll do my other var. So now it'll just output both. It does put a space in between them, right? Now you might think if I take the space out here, it won't have the space, right? And usually that works, right? The other thing too is, let's say I wanted to add them together like this, right? That's not going to work because the PowerShell is going to interpret the plus as just another string, right? It's going to say, oh, that's just a string that, I'm adding that together. Can you add two variables together? Sure you can. So if I put this inside parentheses, that tells the PowerShell, execute what's inside the parentheses first, right? Remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally from 5th grade math, the order of operations, right? But that's not exactly what's happening here, right? Basically, when there's something inside the parentheses, it's treating it different. It's treating what's inside the parentheses as essentially as an object, and this object is being constructed by combining my var with my other var using the concatenation operator, the plus sign, which is when you have a plus between two strings, it just concatenates them, right? In fact, if I hit the play button here with that plus, you can see it outputs foo bar. And if I just hit the play button here, you can see it outputs exactly what I want, foo plus bar, right, together. So that stuff all works, right? Now, working with strings is pretty straightforward. There are other data types, right? For example, integers and dates, right? I'll give you an example with an integer. We'll do num1 equals 1, and num2 equals 2. Pretty straightforward, right? I'll execute these. So now num1 and num2 just have an integer in them. I didn't put quotes around it. It's a number, so PowerShell is going to treat this like an integer. So if I do right-host $num1 plus $num2, now watch what happens, right? It's going to do the same thing that it did when I ran this up here, right? So if I take out the parentheses on this command, all it did was concatenate foo with a plus sign with bar because it treated it as a string. It's going to do the same thing here. It's going to take the 1, concatenate it to the plus, then concatenate it to the 2, which is not exactly what I want. So similar to a string, if I put parentheses around this, now you start to see why using those parentheses can be important. Now it's actually going to execute the command inside here. Now it's not concatenating that because the plus sign between integers means add them, not concatenate them like we did with a string, right? So you can see how that works. There are other data types too. We'll do another one. Let's see. How about we'll do a date, and instead of creating a variable, I'm just gonna write it to the screen. So if I do right-host get-date, all it's gonna do is output the current date time, right? And actually it doesn't because it interpreted this as a string, right? So I have to put parentheses around this for me to get that as a commandlet, right? There we go. So we have the current date and time, right? I'm recording this on April 11th at 2:47 p.m., right? So it gets the current date and time. You can also, so when you use the getDate command, you can use that to explicitly convert some string into a date. So if you run the get-date commandlet and you just pass in a string which is a date. So for example, I'll do 5/23/1979, which is when I happen to be born. It's going to get that and convert that into an actual date that I can work with as a date, right? So as an example, since this is a date, let's say I wanted to know what day of the week I was born, right? I hit dot and I can get the day of the week, right? Because that is a property of getDate. How did I know that? Again, I could have first run get date, pipe it into get member. Get member is a nice, I've showed you this a couple of times now. It shows you everything that you can do with a commandlet, right? Or with the object, right? So it shows you when that commandlet runs, the object that you get, what's all the properties, what are all the methods, right? Methods are things you can do with an object, and properties are attributes about the object, right? And then of course you can have multiple objects, right? So not just one thing, right? Although sometimes we do just have one thing. So if I execute just this line, it's going to tell me that I happen to have been born on a Wednesday, right? I didn't know that. Kind of interesting, right? I never really thought about that. You can also, dates are also a little bit different than than strings, right? Or integers, right? You can add and subtract integers, but it's pretty straightforward, right? If you add, 30 plus 30, it's 60, right? But with dates, you can't just always, add 30 to a date and get the right date, right? If today is the 15th and I add 30, you get 45. That's not a valid date. Computers are smart enough to be able to work with dates, right? So same thing in PowerShell. So as an example, if I wanted to find out how many days it's been since I was born, right? I don't know why I'd want to know that, but if I did, we'll do, let's see, we have to get the current date first, right? So first today's date, and I am going to subtract from today's date my date of birth, right? So this right here is saying whatever comes out of get date, that object, so it's going to be today's date, subtract from that date, and then the value to subtract is going to be my birth date. I'm going to close that parentheses. So that's going to close. You can see it gives me some hints here as I'm doing this. You can see, I don't know if you can see in the video, but there's a little gray highlighting around these two parentheses that tells me I closed this parenthesis. And then likewise, one more is going to close this outer parenthesis. And if I run this, it should tell me that I was born 15,299 days ago, right? So that's how many days it's been since I was born, right? Seems like a lot, I guess. And if I wanted to, I can convert that to years and so forth and so on, right? Now, the other thing about variables is, so far, the strings that I was working with were just a single variable, right? But you can have lists of things inside a variable. And this is, in programming languages, it's frequently called an array, right? In PowerShell, it's just a list, right? We call it a list. And it's really easy in PowerShell to work with lists of things. So for example, let me create a list. So I'll just call it my list. The correct syntax to create a list is use the @ sign with parentheses around it. There are other types of objects you can create, right? So you can use the swiggle brackets, which I can talk about in a different video, but let's keep this simple for right now. Just a list of things can be in the parentheses. That list of things can be anything. It can be any object. So each element, each thing in that list can be just a single string object, right? Strings are just objects. But it could be just a single string object, or it could be an entire other object stuffed into that list, right? So lots of ways to work with lists. They can be very complicated. In other programming languages, you might go to things like multi-dimensional arrays to do something like this, right? In procedural type languages, if you're familiar with those. But here we can just make a list of things. And as an example, right? So with my list, for example, let's say I wanted to store a list of Star Trek movies, right? There's a lot of them. I was trying to brainstorm something that would be a list. So here, first I create my variable, my list, and I'm telling PowerShell because of the @ symbol and the parentheses that the value of this is going to be a list of things. Now I could just list things inside here, right? 1, 2, 3, and so forth, right? So that's one way to create your list. You can explicitly create it like this. I'm just going to create an empty list, and then I'm going to start filling that list. And instead of just using equal sign, I have to use plus equal. Plus equal means take that object, which is my list, and just add a new item to it, right? Instead of, if I didn't use the plus, if it was just equal, it would say replace whatever's in that list with this new list, which would be just one thing on each line. That wouldn't work. So we're going to use the plus equal to say just keep adding the next thing to that list, right? So if I execute these lines, so now my list should be just a list of Star Trek movies, right? So, oops, I meant to use $. So if I output the variable my list, there it is. It's just a list of Star Trek movies. Pretty straightforward, right? And it has properties too, right? For example, count is a good one, right? Count is going to tell me how many movies I put in there. Well, 14, right? I put 14 Star Trek movies in here, right? There was an awful lot of them. I'm missing one here, Star Trek 5. I think we all try to forget about that one. But and of course all the new ones, whatever. But in any event, you've got these properties, and you can work with these, right? So, for example, earlier I was using for each within a single line, but if sometimes it's conceptually easier to start with just doing something like this, like a for loop, for example. Just like most programming languages have for each, for, while. Those same control structures exist in PowerShell, right? So, for example, I'm going to use $I as just my iterator, right? So I'm going to start with I being 0, and while I is less than the count, right? So I'm just going to get the count. Then for each iteration, we're just going to iterate I, right? Pretty straightforward. This is just a pretty normal way to write a loop in most programming languages. The syntax here is, I'll put a space here to make it easier to read. I'm creating a variable called $I. It's going to have a 0 in it on the first iteration of the loop. Each iteration thereafter, it's going to add 1 to each iteration after, right? So it's just a counter, really. Most of the time these loops look like this. And then it's going to exit the loop when $I is less than the count, right? So the count happens to be 14, which means it's going to start at 0, and as long as it's less than 14, it's going to exit. So as soon as we hit 14, it exits. But that's okay because PowerShell is always 0-based, right? Everything in programming is 0-based. So we'll start at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13. When we get to 13, that's actually the 14th item in that list, right? Because the items are actually numbered 0 through 13, even though there's 14 of them, right? Kind of makes it convenient for doing a loop like this without having to do like -1 or +1 or anything like that. Or, less than or equal to or something like that. Real basic here, right, is I can go in here and I'll use write-host, and I am going to write, just so you can see it, $I, right? In fact, I'll run that so you can see it's going to go 0 to 13, right? There we go. There's 0 to 13. But I can access, I'm just going to show you this here. So if I wanted to access one of the items in my list, I can put parentheses and just put the item number inside. I'm sorry, not parentheses. It's going to be square brackets. Different programming languages, different syntax. But if I use the square brackets, it says, just get me item number 3. So that was Star Trek Voyager, right? If I'd say, just get me item number 5, that's going to get me Star Trek the Motion Picture. If I say, just get me item number 7, right? I can do this all day, right? So in here, since I have $I am going to also output, let's see, we'll do my list. But instead of using a instead of putting a hard coding the number in there, we're going to use $I inside the brackets. So each iteration, it's going to get the next value of $I, right? So if I run that, let's see what it does. So you can see it worked. There's my index number, so I know that index 0 has Star Trek, index 1 has Star Trek The Next Generation, index 2 has Star Trek Deep Space Nine, right? So that's each item in my list. I could add some formatting here, right? So I can do something like, let's see, we'll put a colon in there, right? That should work, right? So that works. The problem with this right now is it's adding this extra space in here. So I want to format this as a string instead. One of the cool things about PowerShell is you can use encapsulate this whole thing and make it a string, right? So if I'm going to take these out, and I'm just going to make this look like the string that I want, right? And that should work. Now it's going to fail, right? When I run this, it's going to say, I don't know what $I colon is, right? So the way we handle that is we put parentheses around the $I, right? And that should resolve our issue. Let's take a look. So that kind of resolves the issue, but that's not exactly what we want, right? I think what it's doing is it's outputting the entire object on each iteration. And the reason for that is I also have to surround this with parentheses, right? But, and I'll just show you what this is going to look like. It's still not going to look quite right. So what I have to do is make this actually a variable, right? So I put a $ in front of this, and that dynamically makes this an object. So it's going to first get what's inside the parentheses, make that an object, and then it's going to treat that as a variable outside the parentheses. So if I run this, this should give me exactly what I want with nice clean formatting, right? Of course, I probably don't want these parentheses around here, so I also have to put a $ in front of this telling it that I'm using these parentheses as execution with inside those parentheses, right? Get me that object inside the parentheses. So it's important to use those $. There we go. So that works, right? Again, if I don't put this $ in front of here, it's going to treat these as strings. It thinks that I'm just using them as strings. So I do need to have that $. Okay? All right, now that we know how to work with a list of things, let's see if we can expand this a little bit and instead work with an object, right? So I'm going to do the same thing I did before, right? I'm going to create a list, right? But each item of that list is going to be an object within that list. So this is what we'll start with trying to learn how to deal with objects. So now I have an empty list again, right? So if I look at it, there's nothing in it, right? First step is I have to create my object. So I'm going to create a simple object. Let's say I'm just, movies have more attributes than just the title, right? So I'm going to use movies as an example, all the Star Trek movies that I just showed you. So first I create a new object. I'm just making a generic PowerShell object, right? There are more complicated objects. For example, the output of the ls command was an object, but it was a little more complicated than what I'm doing here. But just for the purposes of demonstration, let's keep this simple. So I have an object called movies, and I can, now that I have that object, right, let me go ahead and execute that line. So now I have an object called movies. There's nothing in it, right? It doesn't really have anything yet. So I'm going to start constructing that object. So we're going to do movies, and we're going to pipe movies into a different command, which is add member. So add member is going to add basically add a member to that or add something to that object, right? So in this case, the member type I'm going to make, just to keep this simple, we'll make it a note property. The name of the parameter is going to be the title, so it's going to be the title of my movie, and the value is going to be, I'm going to copy and paste here. I have my list of movies over here on my other screen. Oops, got 2 Star Treks in there. So Star Trek, the motion picture. So that should now add that element, right? So now I have one item, or that object has one property, and that property is the title, and the value of title is Star Trek, the motion picture. Now I'm going to add a second object, or a second property, right? So another property. Let's see, what else do we need? We need the how about the name of the release date, right? So when did this movie come out? It came out around the time I was born, I think, right? Let's look at the date. So it came out on 12/7/1979, right? Pretty old movie. Now here's the problem: is this is a string. And if you recalled, if we're using a date, we want to cast it as a date. And the way we do that is get date, right? Now you can tell because this is purple, it's not treating this as a commandlet. So remember, parentheses, right? So this just tells PowerShell, when you get that value, you're going to first go and execute this, what's inside the parentheses, and then that object is going to be the value, the output of that. So this happens to be a date object. So this new property contains a date object, right? So you can see how this, objects become really important here. And I know it can get a little bit confusing. And we'll do one more here. We're going to get the name of the director of the movie, and we'll make a property for that as well. I happen to have it already in my other screen. So now that I have all that stuff, I'm going to execute this. Oops, we already have our new object called movies. Oh, whoops, I already executed this line. I can only execute these 2 lines down here, right? But it's saying that they're already there. Now, if I think I screwed up and I just want to start over again, if I run this line, it's going to take whatever's in movies, because it's creating a new object, it's just going to remove the old version and replace it with this new empty one, and then I can populate this again. So I'm going to just do that. So now it's created the object from scratch, right? It says take everything you did and just get rid of it, wipe it from memory, and give me a new one called movies and populate it with, with these properties and values. That's it. Now, of course, I don't have any methods in here. I can't really do anything with this object, right? Other than what's the methods that are included in every object. For example, like toString or something like that, right? You'll see that if you run getMember. In fact, let's do that. If I do get-member on $movies, that should show me the structure of movies. So it tells me that I have 4 methods, equals, get hashcode, get type, and toString. So those are the methods. They're automatically there, right? It's because I created a PowerShell object. PS object has those methods. They're kind of baked in. And then my properties, right, or the note properties, right, is director, director, release date, and title. And it even tells me over here that this one is a string, this one is a system.datetime object, and this is a string object, right? And that's it. Pretty straightforward. So now, if I wanted to, I could add that to my list, right? So just like I did before, we're going to do my list plus equal $movies. And that is going to take, now remember, this is an empty list right now, right? See, there's nothing in there right now. But if I run this line, it's going to take that movies object and add it as a new item in that list. So now that list contains 1 item, but that item is actually an object that contains all the information about the first movie, right? So instead of just being a string object, it's now my custom object that has a lot more information in it. It's still just 1 item, but that item happens to be an object, and within that object are all these different properties and methods, right? But it's all within that list. And in fact, if I output the contents of my list, you can see it shows me that it's basically, my list has 1 object, and it's the attributes about Star Trek the Motion Picture, its release date, and the director, right? Pretty straightforward. I could add additional movies to my list. So I already have this saved over here, so I'm just going to copy and paste a bunch of these for you. So starting at line 44. So I'm going to highlight from 44 down to everything I just added. And that adds a whole bunch of other movies, right? All these other Star Trek movies. And now, once again, if I just output my list, you're going to see all my Star Trek movies that it's going to list. Oh, now we have Star Trek 5 in the list, right? So now it's in there. But in any event, so this is a list of movies, but each item in that list is all the attributes about that movie, including its title and so forth, right? And I can work with that. And just like before, I showed you the ls command. This object, ls command outputs an object that is basically a collection of all your directories and files, and each one of those items has its own methods and properties, right? The things that you can do with it and properties about it that you can output, right? We can do the same thing here. So for example, I can do a count, right? That's going to tell me how many movies I have in my list. I have 10. I can, let's see, we can, well, we already looked at getMember, so we know what our properties, well, we created it anyway, right? But let's do format table, right? So my list, format table. I'll just do format table. That doesn't look a whole lot different than what we did before, but remember, with format table, you can add something like property, and I can say, just give me the title and the release date, right? And that's going to give me just the title and the release date. So again, we can use format table. Earlier, I showed you where object, right? So let's do my list, excuse me, pipe it to where object, and let's do a little query on here. So maybe I only want to see where the director is oops. So the director is equal to, what's one of the names? Jonathan Frakes. I can see it right here. So let me just copy Jonathan Frakes' name. So that should only give me the movies that were directed by Jonathan Frakes. There we go, right? So it gave me a little, I was able to query for just where the object was equal to Jonathan Frakes, where the director was equal to Jonathan Frakes. So it was able to filter that for me. So I can start kind of filtering my objects. I'll give you kind of a, there's other things you can do with where object that are useful. So for example, with where object, I can, again, we'll do director again, but I can never remember how to spell Leonard Nimoy's name. So we're going to do star Leonard. I think I spelled his first name right. I don't remember. Let's see if that gives us any records. I know Leonard Nimoy directed a few movies. Okay, maybe not. Trying to think. How do you spell Leonard? It's Leonard. See, I can't remember how to spell his first or his last name, right? But there you well, nope. That's oh, I forgot the dot. Sorry. There's a dot. It's always those little things that'll get you in PowerShell, right? So if I run this should work now, right? So now I can see two movies that were directed by Leonard Nimoy. And you can get a little more complicated, right? So for example, I could, maybe I want to get all the movies where the release date was after 1998, right? So everything from 1998 and later, right? I graduated high school in 1998. So maybe I want to see all the ones that came out after I graduated from high school. So we'll do my list. Where object and released is greater than. Remember, because it's a date, it's going to be smart enough to know how to do this, right? Remember, we have to use our parentheses. So I want to do greater than 1998, right? So anything from 1998 or later. Now I think this is going to work, but we might need to put a $sign in front of that. But I believe it worked, right? So there we go. So now if I forgot these parentheses, right, that wouldn't work, right? Because it should, it's going to output an error. It doesn't know what the heck I'm trying to do. So we'll always have to remember to put those parentheses. And again, that works. I could get more complicated here. I could say, and the director has to be Jonathan Frakes. So we can combine both, right? We could do some complicated Boolean logic. So only one movie that came out after 1998 was directed by Jonathan Frakes, right? Pretty straightforward. Okay, so at this point, hopefully you have some idea on how to work with objects. But now I want to show you some real-world example of, like, well, this is great, Brian, but how would I use this, right? What's something useful I can do with all this stuff, right? I'll open up a new window here, and one of the options we have is get service. So I want to know a little bit about get service, so I'm going to use get member to show me stuff, right? So get service is a commandlet. I'll just run get service so you can see what it does. It just outputs all the services on your machine, right? So if I pipe that to get member, it's going to show me all the things it knows. Now remember, when I output this, I only see 3 parameters here, right? Whoever created this object, it's created in such a way that if I just run that commandlet, that object, it's only going to output by default in that table format those 3 attributes. But there is so much more available to me in there. For example, the status of the service, the full name of the service, the dependency of that service, whether it's stopped or started, so and so forth, right? There's also methods, right? So look at all these methods. I can stop a service, I can start a service, I can refresh the service, right? So all kinds of other things I can work with. But as an example, and I'll show you the longhand way, right? So a lot of folks, when they start with PowerShell, they might do something like this. They'll do a for each loop, and I can get I can create a variable called service, and that's going to basically be everything that's in get-service. And This is the basic format for a for each loop, right? But I can output something, right? So I could do write dash host $svc, and here's all the parameters for that object, right? It kind of shows me all the parameters and methods. So there's the methods on the bottom, parameters on the top. So I could just get, for example, the name, right? And if I run that, it's just going to output the name of that service. Of course, the name's probably not what I want. I probably want the display name, right? Because it's a little bit easier to understand what that service is. I could also output, for example, the status of that service, right? Now, if I asked you to get me a list of services where the status is running and it's not a Microsoft service, right? Or it is a Microsoft service, right? One or the other, right? Well, first thing you might say is, well, okay, let me check and see if svc dot display name, right, is equal to, or I'm sorry, we got to do like, because we need, oops, I did not mean to put the caps lock on. We're going to say is like Microsoft. By the way, the in PowerShell, oops, I can't tell if my that's better. So the asterisk is the wildcard in PowerShell, in case you're wondering what I'm doing there. With the dash like, it's saying, and by the way, one of the Boolean operators is dash contains. Some people try contains in place of like. It's not going to work, right? Contains is something different. That's if you're looking, so if you have a list of things, contains works, right? You can say if this list contains, for example, in my Star Trek example, if this list contains Star Trek The Next Generation, then return that whole object, right? But that's not what we're looking for here, so don't get confused with contains. But first, if the display name has Microsoft somewhere in it, right? That's what that wildcard's all about. Just look somewhere in that string for Microsoft. If you didn't put the star, this wouldn't work, because it would say it has to be exactly Microsoft. By putting the asterisks on either end, it says, I don't care what's on the front or the back of it, right? Kind of similar to SQL if you've ever worked with SQL. So if that's the case, I'm going to write dash host $svc dot display name. So that's going to output any of my services that have Microsoft somewhere in the name, right? Oh, I did not mean to have this here. We'll get rid of that. All right, so there's all my services that contain Microsoft in the name, but I also want to only show the ones that are running, right? So I'm going to add another if $svc dot status, and I'm going to make sure it's set to running if it's going to display, right? So all right. So now I should just get a list of the running services, right? The only one running is the Microsoft Store install service, right? I don't have any others that looks like that are actually running right now. So a pretty short list, right? By the way, I could also put not like Microsoft, and it'll get me any service that doesn't have Microsoft somewhere in the name that's currently running, and that should be most of them, right? So again, pretty straightforward. Now, I could do that exact same thing, but with one simple line by using some of the syntax I showed you earlier, right? By passing one object to the next, cmdlet, which will output another object, which I can pass to the next object, right? We could do this a little bit faster. So I'm going to get my list of services. I'm going to use where object to do my to check the parameters. So we know we want display name is not like Microsoft. So asterisk Microsoft. I did spell that right? And then and the status is running. All right, so that should just give me that list of services. That makes sense, right? So there's all my running services that do not contain Microsoft anywhere in the name, right? I could also use like if you want to see it the other way, right? There's my one service that's running, right? That's not like Microsoft. But there's one more piece here, is I only want to show maybe I only want to show certain fields, or for example, I can use format table, right? So I can still pass this to format table, and I could pass parameters, right? Or I can pass properties rather, right? But I'll show you another example. I can format table also has a group by, so I can group by a parameter. I'm going to group by service type, right? So now it's going to give me not just a list of all those services, but it's going to group them by what the service type is. There you go, right? So you can start to see how you can get this more complicated output. And I can go one step further. If you really wanted to, you can output this to a file, right? So I could pipe this to out file, and the file path is going to be, or actually, let's just do, we can just do file path, and we'll call it out.txt. All right, it output a file called out.txt. So if I go to C users, whatever that is, I forget what I called it now. Out.txt. Yeah, there it is, right? So it output to a file. So there you go, some useful stuff you can do with PowerShell. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for watching.